Kentuckians love to claim that their state has more miles of flowing streams than any other state in the Union. With a rugged landscape in the eastern Appalachian region, this combination of water and topography resulted in a lush environment that created a healthy ecosystem that supported a diverse population of freshwater fish, ducks, herons, song and game birds, and countless reptiles and amphibians. Critical to this unique environment were floods that resulted from the work of nature's engineer, the beaver. Long before the arrival of humans, beaver ponds and dams created floodplain and meadows and wetlands along the valley streams of Appalachia. Despite eliminating many acres of bottomland hardwoods, beaver ponds and their network of channels and dams also helped prevent widespread flooding by equalizing stream flows during both spring freshets, summer droughts, meadow grasses, and other plant species flourished in the most alluvial soils of the creek and river bottoms surrounding each dam. By the dawn of the 19th century, human activity precipitated dramatic changes to the Appalachia countryside. While the demand for pelts effectively eliminated the beaver population east of the Mississippi River, the growth of the iron industry introduced new environmental concerns. Located near creeks and streams, iron smelting required both water and fuel in the form of charcoal to process ore and drive the forge's hammers and stampers. To fulfill this demand, iron makers diverted and dammed streams and clear-cut the surrounding forest. Worker housing, moreover, concentrated near the furnace, placed additional demands on the landscape. By 1870, historian Donald Davis observed the iron industry had rendered tens of thousands of acres treeless in the Appalachian region. As the country approached the 20th century, the human devastation increased. Both the timber and mining industries had established residential and business patterns, denuded landscapes, and the population concentrations in low-lying areas that would typify central Appalachia throughout the coming century. More interesting, however, was the fact that leading conservationists recognized the potential problems these residential and industrial developments could cause. In 1901, U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt observed that the regulation of the flow of the region's rivers can be accomplished only by the conservation of the forests. Roosevelt recognized two very important concerns in terms of Appalachian industrial development. First, he understood that the topography and climate in the southern mountains was conducive to flooding. Steep valley and plentiful rain were indeed a recipe for these natural occurrences. More important, Roosevelt readily understood that man-made factors, especially those which devastated the landscape, significantly contributed to the flow of the rivers. This project begins with Roosevelt's statement. It accepts the facts of topography and climate, but only to a point. It is more concerned with those man-made facts that Roosevelt also identified. Through the lens of the disastrous flooding of the summer of 2022, this film looks at four major floods that occurred in the 20th century and asks what man-made factors contributed to the extent of the flooding in central Appalachia. How did human alterations to an environment already susceptible to flooding transform natural occurrences into unnatural disasters? On July 4th, 1939, as the people of eastern Kentucky concluded their holiday festivities, disaster struck. From 11 p.m. July 4th to 12:30 a.m. on July 5th, a severe thunderstorm dumped between 12 to 20 inches of rain over the 10 counties in Appalachian Kentucky. While every county was affected, the flash flooding that resulted from the cloudburst, sheets of rainfall that dropped visibility to zero, was particularly severe in Triplet Creek in Rowan County and Frozen Creek in Breathitt County. Both creeks flooded, and in the end, 79 deaths occurred. 25 in Rowan County, 52 in Breathitt County, and 2 in Lewis County. Rowan County saw Triplet Creek rise 10 to 15 feet in less than an hour, while those in Breathitt saw a wall of water 15 to 20 feet in height crash through their valley in roughly 15 minutes. Kentucky Governor A.B. Chandler described the flash flooding as the worst calamity of its kind to ever visit Kentucky. At that time, in 1939, Chandler may have been correct. Undeniably, with rainfall measuring 12 and possibly exceeding 20 inches at the center of the storm, the 1939 flash flood was the result of uncharacteristic precipitation rainfall in areas of steep topography. A geological survey by the Department of Interior issued about the 1939 flood stated that the principal cause of damage in this flood was intense flow rate through drainage basins into irregular overflow routes on both Triplet Creek and Frozen Creek. Due to the thin and narrow nature of Appalachian valleys, Triplet and Frozen Creek were funneled through the steep topography, intensifying the flow rate, leading to more devastating floods. More specifically, the degree of slope in these Appalachian counties resulted in water rushing downhill at tremendous speeds and tumbling over itself, resulting in waves. Water with tremendous velocity hit both Rowan and Breathitt counties. The Department of Interior concluded that high velocities and extreme flow rates out of overflow routes were the principal cause of devastation. Still, there were differences in comparison between the valleys north and east. Rowan County's Triplet Creek has a fairly wide floodplain. Due to this wide nature, Triplet Creek in Morehead rose at a steady pace at 10 to 15 feet in an hour. Frozen Creek, however, more closely resembled typical Appalachian valleys. There, with its much more narrow floodplain, the flood became more violent. Many residents recounted a wall of water 15 feet high rushing into the valley, with pieces of houses, livestock, and cars floating amongst the floodwaters. The water in Frozen Creek was estimated to have risen 20 feet in roughly 10 to 15 minutes. Rain and terrain were not the only contributing factors. According to the Department of Interior report of the 1939 flood, the steep hillside tops, lack of appreciable topsoil, and vegetation consisting almost entirely of second-growth timber accelerated flow rates within Breathitt and Rowan counties. In Morehead, this was a consequence of human interaction. The Morehead North Fork Railroad Company's previous decision to run their rail line parallel to Triplet Creek resulted in many of the trees along its banks being cut down. With the loss of this timber from clear cutting, the water was left uninhibited, resulting in greater human devastation. Additionally, lack of precautions also contributed to the destruction. In 1939, neither Morehead or Jackson had flood walls in place, and little to no citizens in either county, or most of Kentucky, had flood insurance. Still, the sad reality is that flash flooding is highly unpredictable and a natural occurrence in the steep hillsides of Appalachia. The issue then is not with the flooding itself, but how the people of Appalachia ended up living in these floodplains. As coal and timber companies bought the high ground, there was limited space left for Appalachians to live. The 1939 flood served as a warning that the majority of eastern Kentucky's population lived in active floodplains, and that there is negligence by local and state governments to make efforts to protect their citizens in a disaster-prone area. After the floodwaters washed out eastern Kentucky, 79 were dead, 800 homes had been damaged, and $2 million worth of damage was incurred. With little preparation, as mentioned earlier, rescue efforts were taken up primarily by the people who had just been affected by the grotesque flooding. Jack Ellis, a Morehead native who was 12 at the time, stated that it was just local citizens or the firemen who were contributing to the bulk of rescue efforts and body recovery. Stanley Iverson, another Morehead native, attempted to use his boat to rescue people during the flood, but was pushed back by the swift current in the road. Many citizens were frustrated with the Red Cross, which according to Jack Ellis provided clothing, food, and basic medical care, but did little to help rebuild the homes and accommodations that had been lost. Ellis and his wife, Jane, claimed there just wasn't money to rebuild, and that the local government hadn't provided help. Many people who were displaced by the flood moved in with family members or completely left Morehead as a result. The Morehead Independent reported that 20,000 families in eastern Kentucky received assistance from the Red Cross, with $13,000 coming from Louisville, $3,000 from Lexington, and $2,500 from Ashland. Considering the Depression at the time, this was a tremendous response from other localities. Interestingly, the 1939 flood failed to stimulate any preventive measures to mitigate future natural disasters. Other flood-prone cities, such as Johnstown, Pennsylvania, for example, received Depression-era Works Progress Administration funds to construct flood walls and other flood prevention projects. There was a comment made by Sam M. Bailey, the United States Senior Engineer of Flood Control. He said that dams and alarms were far too costly to put them at every dangerous point along the riverbed where families were scattered. Morehead's Triplet Creek has flooded several more times since 1939. Two notable floods, one in 2002 and another in 2015, were both of sizable scale. It was not until the 2002 flood that the city of Morehead decided to form a Triplet Creek Committee and make changes to the creek in an effort to reduce flooding potential in the area of Rowan County. The lack of changes and precautions even directly and far after the disaster speak to the level of concern federal and state governments have about these disasters. Between January 27th and February 2nd, 1957, one of the most devastating floods in the history of the Appalachian Region occurred. The states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia experienced record-breaking flooding as 6 to 9 inches of rain fell across the region. Locally, along the Kentucky-Virginia state line, as much as 12.5 inches of rain fell. Unfortunately, all of this precipitation landed on already saturated ground because the region experienced over 2 inches of snow the week prior. All of this water resulted in record-breaking peak discharge on the tributaries of Kentucky, Holston, and Clinch rivers. Following the flooding, Pikeville native O.S. Batten turned to the Courier-Journal to share his warnings of the possibility of continuous flooding due to the peaks of the Big Sandy River Basin. These peaks derive from the topography of eastern Kentucky, which is riddled with mountains that are separated by narrow valleys. The Big Sandy River is fed by streams from these peaks. Imagine the tributaries of the Big Sandy as fingers. If one finger floods due to moderate rainfall, minimal damage occurs as a result. But when massive amounts of rain falls on saturated ground and is funneled into all 5 fingers, the water meets at the hand and steamrolls through the arm. In this scenario, the small towns that lie along the tributaries are along the arm. Once the floodwaters meet at the hand and rush through the arm, cities like Pikeville, Paintsville, and Barbersville suffer as a result. The damage caused by the flood devastated the already economically challenged region of eastern Kentucky, causing $39 million in damage, $411 million in 2022 in the Big Sandy River Basin. The damage was a consequence of the construction of the region's main highways, railroads, government buildings, and homes along the riverbanks, being confined to the narrow floodplains beneath the Appalachian Mountains. Astonishingly, local officials recorded only 12 deaths, with 9 of them occurring in Kentucky alone. Still, the flood destroyed 597 houses completely, while over 2,900 sustained major damages. State agencies, such as the Citizens Advisory Committee, also reported that the flooding forced 90% of coal mines in Pike, Floyd, Letcher, and Perry counties to shut down. Floodwaters rushed through working mines and caused damage to equipment and machinery necessary to operate a mine. Over 900 mines and manufacturing industries that employed over 28,000 Kentuckians either shut down permanently or halted operations. In the immediate aftermath of the flood, the Kentucky state government and several federal agencies, including the Urban Renewal Administration, cooperated in a study of the flood problem in eastern Kentucky. They analyzed the relationship between flooding and the history of economic hardship in the region. This led to the creation of the Action Programs of Eastern Kentucky. This report advocated for a comprehensive flood prevention program that hoped to deal with the factors that made 1,000-year floods occur 3 or 4 times per century. The study concluded that the region was in desperate need of a comprehensive flood prevention infrastructure that included dams and reservoirs that met the standards of the Army Corps of Engineers, additional flood walls in urban centers, and diversion channels and cutoffs. In response to this study, the federal government established the Federal Flood Indemnity Administration to provide funds for a 5-year experimental insurance program with 3 main goals. 1. To provide direct flood insurance to citizens of the flooded areas. 2. A reinsurance program. And 3. A loan program for citizens who lost homes and other possessions to the 1957 flood. After 1 year of study, the FFIA requested $14 million from the U.S. Congress, but it was ultimately refused. Despite efforts to establish flood prevention programs and a reformed insurance system at both the state and federal levels, the problem of devastating flooding in eastern Kentucky and the rest of Appalachia remains present to this day. Unfortunately, the federal and state governments failed to make good on its flood relief proposals. In the months following the flood, over 30 towns and local organizations, including the local governments of Middlesboro and Salyersville, applied for the construction of small watershed projects. Only 3 of these proposals passed the preliminary cost-benefit test established by the state government and the Army Corps of Engineers, the latter of which came to the conclusion that the topography of Appalachia simply does not lend itself economically to the control of floodwaters. The 1957 flood proves to be a key event in the history of flooding and economic struggle in eastern Kentucky. It was the first time government officials in Washington, D.C. acknowledged the flooding problem in the region. With studies of the issue finally being undertaken and solutions having been proposed, it seemed like this flood could finally be the turning point that led to real change. However, it proved to be just another lost opportunity. This lost opportunity cost the people of eastern Kentucky dearly, as proved by the even more devastating flood that occurred in 1977. Appalachia is more than acquainted with disasters. From forest fires to landslides, the mountain people are aware of the natural dangers to their homes. Few have been as destructive as flooding, though, where 100-year floods seemingly occur every 20 years or so. While on the surface it appears that flooding should be a natural occurrence given the topography and rainfall in the Appalachian Mountains, the reason for flooding often has a more human touch to it. This is more than evident when looking at the disaster of Logan County in 1972, commonly referred to as the Buffalo Creek disaster. Buffalo Creek was much like other Appalachian communities where coal was king. This was especially true for Logan County, West Virginia, home to the Buffalo Mining Company, a subsidiary of the Pittston Corporation. The Pittston Corporation was the 4th largest coal producer at the time and the 4th largest coal producer in West Virginia, owning 8 separate mines in the area. Interestingly, water used to wash coal, suppress dust, and clean equipment was essential to coal mining. The Bureau of Mines and U.S. Geological Survey required mine operators to store this contaminated liquid, called slurry, in pits to avoid polluting the local groundwater. In order to comply with the Bureau of Mines, the Buffalo Mining Company used nearby Buffalo Creek to store its slurry. Designed as a massive filtration system, Buffalo Mining constructed 3 earthen dams to contain, filter, and store what in the end it believed would be reusable water. These dams, built above each other with dam number 3 at the top, ascended up the valley carved by Buffalo Creek. Buffalo Creek Mining, however, failed to follow any standards provided by the Bureau of Mines when building these dams. They had no engineering expertise behind their construction. For dams 1 and 2, a bulldozer worker testified to helping construct both with no previous experience in dam construction and without any oversight by an engineer. Dam 3 did not even have pipes to filter out the slurry and was also built on the sludge foundation left from Dam 2. Even the man who was responsible for the construction of Dam 3 had admitted that there were no engineering calculations on Middle Fork. Dam 1 had also failed once, topped by the slurry which caused a small flood. Nothing was done to fix Dam 1 after the incident. It was clear from both the inability to reach the standard of safety set for building dams and the previous dam's failures that they would not last. This gross negligence had lasted until February 26, 1972. On that day, a moderate precipitation produced 1 to 2 inches of rain. As the rain fell, the company continued pumping refuse water into the dams, which kept the slurry level rising. This was clearly a concern for the employee who had built Dam 3, who had watched the rising water levels and wished that the rain would stop. Eventually, Dam 3 had gave way under the pressure of 130 million gallons of contaminated water. A domino effect then occurred, snowballing the amount of slurry until finally Dam 1 broke, unleashing a torrent into the valley and creating waves that reached 30 feet tall and achieving blistering speeds of 30 miles per hour. The rolling wave crashed into 16 different communities, devastating everything in its path, taking over 125 lives of men, women, and children. It destroyed over 550 homes while damaging over 1,000 others. Over 4,000 people did survive one of the worst disasters in West Virginia and Appalachian history.
It was just a snowball effect. And it took the first one, the second one, the third one, and people literally, was like in eastern Kentucky here recently, ran for their lives. All they could do was run up the side of the hill to get out of the way of the water.
After the disaster, the U.S. Bureau of Mines analyzed each of the dams and determined that each one failed to be, quote, in conformance with current practices of the silver engineering profession in the design and construction of water retention dams. Survivors filed a class action lawsuit against the Buffalo Mining Company and the Pittston Corporation. Pittston, at first claiming that the disaster was an act of God, eventually chose to settle with the 4,000 plaintiffs. The settlement was for $13.5 million, a little over $88.1 million today when adjusted for inflation. Each person received $13,000, which equates to a little over $90,000 in today's currency, barely enough to purchase a home and certainly not enough to restart their broken lives.
It was Pittston was the mining company, and they ended up having to pay out a lot of money to the survivors, but it was pittance what they had to pay, compared to what they should have received.
In the wake of the disaster, the Federal Bureau of Mines and U.S. Geological Survey had passed Code of Federal Regulations 30 CFR Section 77.216, which heightened the standard that must be achieved when constructing and maintaining slurry pit dams. No other major mine-related dam incident has occurred since the passing of this regulation, excluding the Martin County slurry spill in 2000, which was a leak as opposed to a dam failure. While the new legislation has worked, it is incomprehensible why the standard would allow such a disaster to occur. It should not take the sacrifice of an entire community to change a clearly broken system. It would be insulting to describe the Buffalo Creek incident as an act of God. The meager amount of rainfall paired with the poor construction and repeated failures of the dams made it clear that there was something wrong with the only barrier that held back millions of gallons of water. The gross negligence of the Pittston Corporation had not only murdered 125 innocent civilians, but also destroyed the lives of 4,000 people. The lack of any ethical business practices, along with the clear disregard that the company had held for the safety of those that they had put in danger with their negligent use of slurry pits, is an affront to the idea that this could be in any sense a natural disaster. In April 1977, Appalachia experienced another flood. People began to ask questions of why flooding of such destruction continues to happen, and why is the region not better protected from this flooding. The National Weather Service informed the mayor of Pineville, Bob Madden, that the Cumberland River should crest only a few inches above the flood wall. They were unaware, however, that Black Mountain, an active coal mining zone, was still covered in snow that was rapidly melting. Thousands of gallons of melted snow rushed the swollen Cumberland River. Just before midnight on April 4th, the water crested the top of the wall and reached around 18 feet above ground level. The next day, the river began to recede. This, however, provided little relief to the residents of Pineville as the floodwaters were trapped inside the flood wall, with no way to drain. This worsened when the Army Corps of Engineers attempted to open the floodgates, but due to simultaneous attempts by the Corps and local officials, the gates remained closed, with water levels only returning to normal by the afternoon of April 6th. In keeping with common practice, the federal government, through the U.S. Geological Survey and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, conducted a study of the weather conditions that precipitated the flood. As expected, the federal report listed heavy rains as the chief culprit. Along with the Tug Fork Basin, for example, the report revealed that a record 15.5 inches of rain fell in roughly 30 hours and that the flood discharges through the region, including the Ohio, Cumberland, Holston, and Kentucky river basins, quote, were greater than those for 100 years at 29 streamflow measurement sites. In addition, 22 lives were lost and total property damages reportedly exceeded $400 million in the four-state area. Focusing on the mountain counties in the states of Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia, and North Carolina, the Appalachian Land Ownership Task Force, also known as ALOT, found that in 80 counties there were just a few absentee corporations that owned more than 20% of the available land. Revenue made by these corporations and absentee owners do not go back into the local economy of Appalachia. The mineral and land rights were purchased decades ago. As a result, buyers only paid about 90 cents per acre, or what would equal $3.23 today. In 1972, the total Forest Service payments to Appalachian counties were less than 10% of the total revenue. The A-Lot points out that property taxes remain unchanged as the owners have not appraised the land in the decades since. In the 60s, a tax assessor of Knott County, Kentucky stated, "The coal companies pretty much set their own assessments. We pretty much have to work with them. We have no system for finding out how much they own, like they tell us 50 acres at a certain place when it is actually 500. The Kentucky Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Protection found in 1976, across 15 counties there were 191,000 acres where reclamation has not begun or is not at a condition that is considered acceptable. After the flood, studies were conducted to identify the prevalent causes. On May 26, 1977, a representative of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers told area residents not to expect any major flood projects to be undertaken by the federal government. In response, the mayor of Pineville claimed, "I was on the phone with officers of Harlan County, the National Weather Service, and the Corps of Engineers. They all knew we had it, and all they could say was good luck." Then President Jimmy Carter signed into law the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act of 1977. This act required coal companies to perform proper reclamation efforts, implement permanent vegetation, and allocate funds to reclaim abandoned land that was inadequately claimed. Corporations conducted improper reclamation efforts with no contemporary examples. With a pattern of exploitation, constant poverty, and an inability to terraform the region, Appalachia has always been doomed with floods, and no significant action has been taken to prevent such disasters when the region has been and is exploited. Mining operations in areas like Pineville, Middlesboro, and Bell County are not distant memories. They remain and have resurged, with much of Bell County still subject to coal and forestry's influence. If these absentee corporations continue to hold sway, and public interest in seeing change remains low, then these 100-year floods will not only remain, but they will worsen in frequency and intensity. On July 28, 2022, Appalachia experienced what may have been its worst flood ever. Particularly hard hit was eastern Kentucky, including the counties of Breathitt, Letcher, and Knott. At least 37 people died in this catastrophe. This was the second major flood to hit Appalachia, Kentucky in under 2 years. One Breathitt County, Kentucky resident describing flooding in Appalachia as more and more, worse and worse. While this comment references the climate change that has made flooding in a region already prone to it worse, it also acknowledges the long-term issues that have made flooding especially devastating in the southern mountains. This investigation has illustrated those enduring problems that transcend climate and topography that have further contributed significantly to that devastation. With the hillsides and mountaintops firmly in the hands of mostly outside corporate interests, the majority of Appalachian residents are squeezed into the floodplain. Furthermore, far too few of these communities have adequate flood protection. Making matters worse, public authority lacks the political will to reform the tax code to ensure that those absentee owners pay their fair share and obtain the resources, let alone construct, necessary flood prevention. Even if people could move up the mountainside, that same Breathitt County resident observed, quote, "The mountains slide." In 1901, Theodore Roosevelt warned us that denuded hillsides enhanced the potential for flooding. Since then, we have ignored Roosevelt's warning and have engaged in practices, including strip mining and mountaintop removal and its concomitant deforestation, that increase the scale of environmental destruction. This, in turn, increases the rate of climate change. This reality, coupled with Appalachia's other long-term issues, should force us to ask,
did we not learn from history?